I mean, look, I got an email from Xavier Guillory's mother yesterday, and it was a very kind email.
We meet again, Mr. Waldman.
We surely do. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, man. I realized today you are the first repeat late round perspectives guest that I've.
No way.
Yeah, because I've done other shows on the late round podcast, because within the feed you get the regular solo show that I do and whatnot, and then you also get this perspectives episode. And I've had folks, Harmon comes on to talk wide receivers and stuff like that each year during the draft time, but perspectives is sort of this different entity of like, we're not specifically just talking about wide receivers, or we're not specifically talking about one topic. And I think I knew, but I like fully realized, I'm like, oh, Waldman is the first one, because we had our meetup, if you will, last year, where we got to do the little film versus analytics talk and discussion, and obviously dig into that class. But you're the first one that's returning.
Well, I'm honored. I'm glad I made it back. I made the cut, and we can have a good time talking about this class for sure. Because I know that a lot of people that follow what I do and follow what you do had a lot of good feedback for us getting a chance to talk and
100%
talk things over, and it was just a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. And I also I have to give you the yearly note that you are a sick human being for putting together the rookie scouting portfolio the way that you do. Well, like I said it last year, I'll say it again. Like, there aren't a ton of prospect guides out there in general, or, rookie guides out there in general. But a lot of them that are out there, they generally will take like the top 20 or so guys at each position and kind of dig in. You have like the Bruglers of the world doing the beast and stuff like that. And so he's certainly not part of this group. And so I do it, I look at every running back and wide receiver that was at the combine. So like this year, in the late round prospect guide, I had 80 running back and wide receiver profiles, which is not a little amount to put together. No. And then every year I look at your RSP and I'm like, this guy has a more of an illness, a deeper illness than I could ever even dream of. It's crazy how much stuff is in there, man. So props to you. Congratulations on finishing yet another RSP.
I appreciate it, but I've enjoyed reading your guide as well. It's been fun. It's well written. It's got a great sense of humor, and it's just a very good way of being able to, frame stories and tell stories in the way that you do. You're a good writer, and it's fun to be able to, it's a fun and informative read, and I think that's great, because a lot of this information can be very dry.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what, especially when I'm doing this from like an analytics perspective. I mean, regardless of the perspective that you're really coming at it from, when you get to some of the lower tiered players, it is a monotonous thing that you're going through, right? Because it's just like you're trying to find, you don't want to be a jerk either. We're not doing this from the perspective of like, we're better than them at football, or I've always, have you ever had that like sort of dissonance of like, you're evaluating these players and you're saying negative things about them, and obviously not about them as humans, but about their skill set and such. Does that ever bother you to a degree?
It's hard, because you want to frame it, and sometimes you want to have a sense of humor about it.
Right.
Like somebody like Kyle McCord, where I would joke that his penchant for throwing targets, throwing to targets that are really well covered, and then doubling down in that. Yeah. And I joke around that I would nickname him Hold My Beer, is kind of a, you feel bad a little bit, but you want the sense of humor, but you also try and phrase it to people and say, listen, at the beginning of this, I have all the respect. These guys are in the
they're the best of the best.
They're the best of the best. So, when I say some of this stuff, it's not an attack on them. And most of the time I'm trying to explain, if he can fix this, he can be really good. These are some things that are really good. Here's some things that aren't. And I'm going to pick on him a little bit, but I mean him in good nature. Yeah. I mean, look, I got an email from Xavier Guillory's mother yesterday. Wow. And it was a very kind email. Now, Xavier Guillory isn't anywhere in my top 25 wide receivers.
Yeah.
And there's some things that I really liked about him, but it was very kind. So you see that like family members can do that. And I once I think I once went all over CJ Precise on video with a guest saying this guy really needs work in these areas. And I got an email from his brother about a week later, and he said, CJ took your tape to the Notre Dame running back coach and said, "What I think some of this is valid. What do you think?"
Wow.
And the running back coach said, "Everything in there is 100% right. And I would suggest if you want to follow up with him, maybe he can, maybe, you know, you might be able to see if he knows a running back coach or if there's anything like that." And I happen to know a running back coach who worked with people, and he worked with CJ Precise before the draft.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, look, if players can approach it from the standpoint of you have a trusted source, you have someone who obviously knows what they're doing, and they can take that constructive criticism. You know, it's not like you're some random dude on Reddit who's just screaming into the void, you know, and just saying things. Yeah,
you want to balance it, and sometimes there's times I look at stuff and go, okay, I might be being too mean here, and I tamp it back. Yeah. But most of the time I try to say to people, look, we got a little laugh and yuck about it. But I'm sure people can joke about me and go, Matt Waldman, we can't get him on a podcast for more than, for 30 minutes because it's going to probably go over by 60.
Hey, I'm all for that. I'm all for that. Like I was thinking, like I have like Corey Kiner was one of the backs who was at the combine, and one of the things that like I don't care at all about like hand size or anything like that at running back or what have you. If they can catch, they can catch. But he had, I don't know if you saw this, but he had sub 8-inch hands at the combine. And I was writing his profile, and I like started out the profile in the guide. I was like, he has this, blah, 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 but he also has these sub 8-inch hands. And then I wrote another paragraph, and then I just went back and I said, I just can't get over the hand size because it's just so ungodly small. Those are the smallest hands. I think it was the second smallest hands of a player at the combine that we had ever seen. And it's just a weird, I'm not like, I hope he has a great career. It was just a funny thing that
it is. I mean, I can't help but thinking of Little Mittens every time when you mention about it,
right?
Like, but at the same time, it's almost like you think of things like, oh, if he plays further north in Ohio, it might not get him your kids' mittens, and it might do the trick,
Right.
But at the same time, he is a tough runner. He's very physical, and and you look at all that, it's the same thing. Like you play some of that stuff's just too funny, and then and they've heard it. Like Brock Purdy, I worked with Will Hewlett, Brock Purdy, Caleb Williams, Anthony Richardson's quarterback coach, and I've provided scouting reports pre-draft for them to all those guys. And when I did that for Purdy, Purdy was my 6th ranked quarterback. He had a grade that was comparable to a lot of the quarterbacks in this class who could be starters down the line. And I said, in the right environment, he could become a starter. And so, but I asked Will about Purdy, and he said, Purdy, the first thing he said when we sat down to meet, he said, I want you to be ruthless about what it is that I need to do better. Don't hold back. I don't need to be stroked about how good I am, because I know I'm not nearly good enough right now to be where I want to be, and just lay it on me, so it's, that most players have that mentality. As long as you're not being an ass to them, right? It's okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to imagine a player getting to where they are to be invited to the NFL Combine and not being able to have that kind of thick skin and understanding that they're not going to be flawless players,
Yeah. If you're given constructive criticism, but you pick on it a little bit, I'm sure coaches do the same thing, and players do the same thing.
That's a really good point. Yeah, they're getting reamed out anyway by the coaches way more than they are by a fantasy football podcast.
Yeah, I mean, when I used to play music, I had a teacher who used to play with guys like Sinatra and all these like big time jazz musicians and pop musicians, and he learned in that environment where you go to clubs on the south side of Chicago, and they basically play you off the stage and humiliate you, And so we'd have these small group classes where you'd play a song, and then basically like he'd critique it. And I remember one time I was in a group and the drummer played something that was off, and it threw everybody off, and I was soloing during it. And I remember like at the end of it, like everyone was always scared to death, like playing with it, and he'd go, okay. Let's play over that part again, and the guy kind of screwed it up again. So then he goes, okay. He starts getting drummers from everywhere in the class to play it, and then they're done. And he goes, if I were running this gig, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired. I'd keep you on the gig for another week until we got to the next town where there was some decent drummers, and then you'd be fired. You'd be fired. He goes, you I'd probably keep, but I'd probably yell at you for what you just did, what you did here, and you're just like, oh God, So and I laughed because the only compliment I ever got in that thing was like, he goes, the saxophone player had better time than you did. He goes, he's the one who put everything back on track. Maybe we should teach him how to play drums. I was just like, oh my God.
That's so good.
And I'm sure that I'm sure the University of Miami football team at that time, back in the late 80s, Jimmy Johnson was probably a lot harsher than this guy was. That's for sure.
Yeah, 100%. Like I said, you just finished your RSP, published April 1st. Yes, that's and so it's out there for anyone who wants to, but you should check it out for sure. But I wanted to ask you, like, one of the things that I really appreciate about it, and I don't have the benefit of doing this because of the way that like my prospect model is kind of constructed, and that I do, I draft capital as part of it because I'm trying to predict fantasy football at the end of the day. I think that you do a little bit more you do a lot more from the perspective of, is this guy just generally like good or not? Whereas I'm approaching it from the perspective of, does this player sort of fit what works in fantasy football, And I say that because I appreciate that, especially in the pre-draft RSP, you're not afraid to, just tell it how it is or tell it how you see it, right? And so, for instance, and we'll get to this player in a second, but for instance, you have Tahj Brooks as your RB3 in these rankings, right, pre-draft.
Right.
But clearly, Tahj Brooks, like, you can look at any sort of consensus or NFL mock draft database, wherever you want to look, and he's more than likely going to be a day 3, maybe UDFA, but let's just say, because it's such a good class, but let's just say that he's a day 3 guy. So my question to you, obviously you're trying to help from a fantasy football perspective, and we know there's going to be a correlation between where guys get drafted and how strong they're going to be. So how do you look at, these players pre-draft, and then you see them post-draft? So Tahj Brooks, let's just use him as the example because I think it's easiest to just go forward with an example. But let's say that Brooks, goes round 6, right? And you have him as the RB3. How do you then adjust and look at that from pre to post-draft?
Sure. And for folks who may not be aware, part of my service of what I offer for $21.95 is the pre-draft that we've been talking about, the pre-draft publication. And then I come out with a post-draft publication no later than 7 days from the last day of the draft. Mm-hmm. And what's in there is a re-ranking based on player fit. I give you a cheat sheet that has those re-rankings, and I look at ADP versus my pre-draft ranking or my post-draft ranking and kind of give you a sweet spot. So if I'm still like, say, I like Nick Chubb better than Saquon Barkley coming out. That was one of the things that I was known for. So I looked at that and I said, oh, he's going to Cleveland. They have a good offensive line. Carlos Hyde. Yeah. Okay. Whatever. Good back. But Nick Chubb, I still believe in.
Just a little bit better than Carlos Hyde.
Yeah. A little bit better. But at the time he was playing special returning punts and they thought he was old Frank Gore with bad knees. And so I looked at that and said, okay, ADP says, you can probably get him at the beginning and the middle of the 3rd round, but my value of him is he's running back 1 in terms of talent. I still am not backing down from that one. And so I said, you can get him at pick 25 to pick 30. And I gave like a sweet spot range that says, here's where you can get him. So all of that, you get that later. It's not as big as the RSP. It's more of like 100 pages.
Sure.
And
only 100 pages.
Only 100 pages. It's a template now, so it's easier to write into. But anyway, there's that. So how I adjust. I mean, draft capital absolutely matters in the standpoint of how teams use they want to double down on their investment. They want to give their investment all the opportunities to earn what they think they deserve, which is those opportunities to grow and develop. So, I think Jordan Rodriguez calls it pretty pick privilege or something like that, or early pick privilege. And I've always been a believer in that. Ryan Riddle kind of talked about that concept way back in the day. Bleacher Reporter, former NFL player we're good friends, and I always reference him. But you look at that and you say, okay, if they're a day 3 prospect, most likely it's at the very best they're gonna need one, if not two, players to get injured
Mm-hmm.
and be out for an extended period of time for him to even get a chance.
Right.
To just compete for that. He may not even make an active roster spot if it's like, round 6, round 7, or UDFA.
Right.
So at that point, I'm going to knock them down significantly on my board post draft. And likely say, or if the running back class is weak or other classes are weak,
Mm-hmm.
I might still have them higher than some people just because I like the talent. But I'm more of a believer that based on fit, with the scheme, are they a gap scheme runner going to a zone scheme?
Right.
And never had experience with that? Are they on a loaded depth chart? What are the contract lengths for the players ahead of them? I even provide all of that information for people so that they see, here's what I think of the players ahead of this guy, how much time they have left, and and what that's gonna, and how that can potentially fit. So usually that means, a guy like Ladd McConkey last year is a good example, and Marvin Harrison are good examples. I had Marvin Harrison wide receiver 2 pre-draft. I think I had Ladd McConkey somewhere between 7 and 10.
Mm-hmm.
But when Ladd McConkey went to the Chargers and he was with the Ravens, former Ravens coordinator, who was the 49ers, had Michael Crabtree, and I saw that they lead their offense through their slot receiver. And you look at the receivers they had, I'm like, okay, I'm all in on McConkey. He's a top 15 player in redraft at the not 15 but top 15 receiver. And with Harrison, I looked at Kyler Murray, and I'm infamous for kind of making fun of Kyler Murray a lot.
Sure.
And I looked at that and said, no, I know where Harrison's weaknesses are with his hands and how he attacks the ball, and Murray's not going to be the one it's not going to be a good combination, and he doesn't feed his multiple receivers well enough. It's either one or nobody,
right?
Too often. And so at that point, you kind of adjust. I look at the histories of all that stuff. So there's a lot of factors that go into it.
Yeah.
But absolutely, you look at Tahj Brooks, and I'll joke around that I seem to like running backs with the last name Brooks. Kennedy, Tahj, Christopher, they're going to be my sleepers for some reason. I like Brooks, but the thing is that they're with Brooks, if he's like a round 5 guy, in the NFL, and the guy has like a year left, I may not drop him as far down as people would expect.
Yeah.
If he's an undrafted free agent and he's going to have to compete with a guy with earlier draft capital who I thought was talented.
Yeah.
Not like Isaiah Spiller. Like he was behind a guy like Isaiah Spiller, I'd go, forget it, I'm taking the chance.
Yeah, sure.
But if it's somebody else that I liked, then I might be looking at that and going, yeah, we're going to have to wait and see. So for what I always recommend to people who are a subscriber to the RSP is, if you're a fantasy player, you're going to like the post draft a lot more right away.
Right.
It's to the point. It tells you what you need to know, where to draft, gives you strategic points. But you're going to find out as a dynasty player most often that you're going to refer into the pre-draft for the next 2-3 years, because when somebody does emerge, that everybody goes, wait a minute, I don't even know who this guy is. Let me read him. Or you read something where the guy failed early and you go, oh, well, Matt said if he lands in a gap scheme, he could be good. Like Ollie Gordon would be a good example this year. Ollie Gordon, I don't think knows how to run zone very well, and he's not a very good between the tackles guy, but you get him in space, or you give him one decision and block it upright, and all that physical ability can shine through for what he does well. So if he lands on like the 49ers after like 2 stops somewhere else and gets cut, and Kyle asks Emperor Palpatine up at the top of the of the stadium there, his daddy Shanahan, if this is okay to do, I'm kidding, but to do that, then they might bring in Ollie Gordon. You go, okay, now I see where that would be a good opportunity.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of value that is still kind of like untapped and unseen by a lot of like redraft and season long fanatics, which is the majority of people who play fantasy football, obviously. But there's still like a big gap between them understanding that this rookie information and consuming it this time of year / just having that sort of backbone can be so valuable when you're in the middle of week 9 and crazy things are happening. And then all of a sudden, like I always go back to Aaron Jones, because I loved Aaron Jones coming out. This was kind of like when I was first kind of getting more into prospecting and stuff like that. And, unbelievable production profile. He checked really every box. I think a lot of the reason that he probably dropped was the program strength and smaller school stuff and what have you. But regardless, I didn't think Jamal Williams was that bad of a prospect either. But, you go back to that, and I referenced this actually like last week on the show, but you go back to that Thursday night game and Ty Montgomery goes down and Jamal Williams goes down. And then all of a sudden you're at your RB3. And I'm sitting there, I remember tweeting just my pants were off. I was so excited. Aaron Jones is going to get an opportunity. And, he didn't necessarily like blow up his rookie year, but you could see flashes that he was going to be, a good player. And so having that like backbone just allows you to be a lot quicker than the rest of your league mates when making these decisions. And that's why, again, your Tahj Brooks ranking, you're like, I totally understand the utility and how you can use that and how you can deploy that then with your own leagues, because you now know you don't have, like, you can still look at ADP and still like, draft off of ADP to a degree, but then know that you can reach a little bit for Tahj Brooks because Waldman said that you should reach a little bit for Tahj Brooks.
Yeah, I mean, like, Isaiah Pacheco is an example of a guy I liked more than other people, probably you as well. And then, like, I can go as far back before I even started writing this. I remember being in a league where I traded away Chris Warren. I had a good team. I traded away Chris Warren, and I had picked up this guy. I drafted this guy late by the name of Fred Lane, a UDFA out of Lane College for the Carolina Panthers. And Tim Biaka Batuka went down. Some of you listening to this probably don't even know who any of these guys are. But I remember, like, I had Corey Dillon and rookie Corey Dillon, who I knew I really liked. Yeah. And I had Biaka, but I had Fred Lane, but I got desperate because I was like thinking I need to keep on my pace. So I traded away Corey Dillon for Chris Warren. And my friend won that league. And because Chris Warren basically ran for 278 yards, I think, in that rookie year in one game. Yeah. and I had 5 shots in a row from Fred Lane in the end zone for me to get to that game, and I lost by a yard. Yeah. But like the thing is I just gave you 2 rookies from various ranges who were very impactful, in this league. And I realized there, it's like, okay, well, Corey Dillon didn't really get going until about halfway through the season. Yeah. And Fred Lane, nobody even heard of, and he's the only reason I got in the playoffs with that team, because I traded away, because Chris Warren got hurt and then didn't play well. Yeah. So, you can be the thing about rookies is that the more you can be preemptive rather than you have to wait to bid so much money. You can go, oh, this guy's going down. Nobody's talking about that this kid might get his shot. Exactly. I have 2 roster spots available. I'll use one of them on this guy. And if not, I'll just toss him back if it doesn't work out. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, let's get into these players a little bit. This running back class, I think consensus agrees that it's unbelievably good. How would you rank this one? I mean, you don't have to give like a hardcore ranking, but where would you sort of place this amongst other classes since, over the last 15 years or so? Like, is this 2017 all over? Like, is this going to be, are we going to see results that are that good or even better? I think there's potential for that, but if I'd say that turned out to be an A+ class, let's go ahead and say this is a B to B+ class. Okay. And I know that some people would go, well, I hear all this great stuff, but you look at the running backs and you're looking at where I have them graded. I see that this is a class where we could find, if 3 or 4 players turn out to be as good as people think they are, it will be an B+ to A- class for sure. If we get 5 or 6, now we're talking 2017 territory. Right. Most likely what's going to happen is there are going to be 6 to 7. There could be 6 to 7 backs in this class who have 1 to 3,000 yard seasons, but I wouldn't be shocked if 3 to 4 of those 7 are like Tim Hightower, where you it's like year 3, he's an 800, 900,000 yard player. Year 5, somewhere in a new town, somebody gets hurt, and now he does this. Latavius Murray, suddenly, like year 8, he does something really good. Or we get a Justin Forsett who shows up and lands on the Baltimore Ravens, and Ray Rice is suspended, and now suddenly, now he's an 1,100 yard back, or Chester Taylor. It's like, I think we're going to have a lot of backs like that. Okay. The problem is, and you're also going to, and part of it too is I think we're going to see in round 5 and round 6, a lot of guys get drafted, and it'll be that Jamal Williams, Aaron Jones scenario where they draft, like, I hope this doesn't happen because I like Damien Martinez, but say they draft Damien Martinez in round 5, and then they follow up in round 6 and get a guy like, let's just say, Tahj Brooks, and now you're like, let him compete and see what happens.
Yeah.
And now one of them gets the opportunity. The other one ends up shipped off on a practice squad somewhere else, and they're labeled just a special teams guy until people get hurt and they don't know what they have in them.
Yeah, I mean, things always look way cleaner pre-draft than they do post-draft, all the time. I mean, you're going to get a team that drafts probably a day 2 back that we didn't expect them to draft a day 2 back, because it happens pretty much every year. So it makes sense that we could see something like that go down. So I know that both of us are not like big rankings people for various reasons. You spell that out in detail in the RSP. Talking about different archetypes and different types of players. That it's a really weird thing to do when you do sit down and do it and think about it. It's like, how am I ranking Ladd McConkey versus Mike Evans or whatever? It's like, right. it's a really weird thing at the end of the day, just because they're not going to score points and do things the same way, let alone doing that, from a prospecting perspective where we're really just looking at them as talents, not even necessarily like we know how many fantasy points they're scoring and like what environment they're in, all that kind of stuff. So I don't want to, have people listen to this and think that I'm approaching this from this is your set in stone ranking versus this is the ranking that the consensus feels right now, because I don't think that's a really helpful thing to do. Instead, I'm going to just generalize, right? And I'm going to say, okay, you seem to be a little bit higher on this player. What is it that you like about this player? And then I'll give you some analytical stuff about that guy. And I basically to ask you questions to see if some of the analytics back what you're seeing with these guys. So I'm going to start things off at running back. We'll start with Quinshon Judkins, your RB2. We could talk about Ashton Genty for years, of course, but, most will have him at RB1. But with Quinshon Judkins, you have him at RB2. I don't think it's like a flaming hot take or anything like that. Like, he's obviously a good player. My analytical pushback, if you will, is that he didn't have the best overall receiving profile that I've seen. I think that and I also want to ask you this, because I brought this up a lot on the show too, because this will be a general thing that we can kind of go back to and talk about throughout all the running backs. But when it comes to pass catching at running back and like how it translates to fantasy football in particular, I've always kind of like high level categorized these guys as you're elite at that trait and that skill. Like, you're a Christian McCaffrey type player, you're Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, or you're just a very, very bad player at that. Like, you're not going to be used in that way at all at the NFL level. And then there's this middle ground, right? And that middle ground has a really wide range of types of players, but you're going to get players from maybe a Judkins or like a Jonathan Taylor to Kenneth Walker, like players who can do these things, but maybe don't display the traits that will make them a 15, 16% target share player at the NFL level. And so with Quinshon Judkins, I have the metric breakout score, which is basically age and program adjusted receiving production, because my running back model no longer even uses running back or rushing metrics, which is also just kind of weird and wild. But, his breakout score was a little bit below average. His best season in reception share, which is predictive, especially in the first few rounds of the draft, was only 8.6%. Now he's getting boosted by teammate score, and, he played with good guys, even at Ole Miss. I mean, he played with quality running backs throughout.
Zach Evans was a good prospect.
Yeah. Zach Evans was decent, and then obviously Travion Henderson now, at Ohio State. So I understand the kind of brushing off the receiving production to a degree. I've kind of looked at it as, if you look at him from like a usage projection in the NFL, it could be a Jonathan Taylor type situation where and I'm not saying he's that player, I just mean just straight up usage, lots of early down work, good goal line work, and then maybe not like a plus as a receiver, but enough of these easy looks out in space that he can at least do something with the ball in his hands. Is that an improper way, or is that how you view him? And then do you just like him that much more than as a rusher, a pure rusher, and that's why you have him currently as your RB2?
It's a great question. I think to start with, when I look at the way I score players is really a lot of it is how because there's a wide range of what a running back can be. then what I'm looking for is who does things in the variety of combinations the best. So you can, I think my scoring system has done a pretty good job of identifying that a Jahmyr Gibbs is really good.
Yeah.
And also identifying that a Nick Chubb is really good, and they're very different backs. So the thing for me is that when I look at Judkins, his profile of what appeals to teams is both broad and deep in talent. And so from a receiver standpoint, I like how, you gave it a simple, like, here's how I look at it. I'm similar way. Like, to me, like all those guys you mentioned in Austin Eckler, guys who can run wide receiver routes,
right.
and have the athletic ability to beat linebackers and safeties, and occasionally maybe even a cornerback on certain routes, and can win in the vertical game against some of those defenders. They're special. They're the top end. Then you've got guys who can win one-on-one on like angle routes, Texas routes, things like that, where you're angling out from the backfield and cutting back in or outside. And, a Jonathan Taylor is a good example of a player who can do that when used as such.
Right.
But, and then you have guys who maybe they don't win one-on-one, but they're good leak receivers.
Yeah.
Like James Conner is a good leak receiver. He's going to get the little shovel passes, screens, little flat routes in space, RPO occasionally, and they can do that. And I see Quinshon Judkins as being that kind of guy. Okay. He does have some technique flaws with catching the ball that just need to be cleaned up, but the top wide receivers have the same flaws.
Yeah.
So there are things that he's got to, but I've seen him run angle routes against one-on-one against linebackers at Ohio State and Ole Miss and go, okay, this guy actually has a feel for how to beat someone one-on-one and efficiently and with the right kind of movement and win the ball and be able to, like, I've seen him earn the ball, take hits, do it in tight coverage, extend and win targets that are difficult, but he just sometimes drops the ball. So when I look at that, I go, yeah, he's probably a B back in the A back, B back thing, the bigger guy. But if called upon to be the main back, I think he has enough of the explosion, enough of the vision and understanding of how to create within different schemes, and just enough receiving skill to end up being like not in style, but like a James Conner type of back who you go, okay, maybe he's never a top 5 back, or that's maybe one good season like that, but he top 15 running back for several years. I think the potential's there for him.
Yeah, there seems to be, to me, a decent amount of like safety with Judkins as a player, from a forecasting perspective. Whereas, when you have more of a specialist type or someone like I don't want to say Travion Henderson. I think that's probably a little bit too far, but even like when you're looking at like Brashard Smith or something, where it's like you have this one lane that you're kind of needing to go down and go in. And if you don't hit that lane when you get to the NFL, there's going to be problems in terms of you finding the field and getting production. Whereas there's at least multiple outs for Judkins, right? There's an out of like, he could just be more of an early down guy and get, a 7% target share. And okay, he could still be an RB2 in certain situations, but there's also still a little bit of that upside of him developing a little bit more as the receiver.
Yeah, I mean, I even like the Travion Henderson one, even though Henderson is high on most people's boards, and he's high enough on mine that he's a top 5 back on my board. But the difference between him is a few spots between him and Judkins. Yeah, and the difference is that for me, Travion Henderson, if it's blocked right inside, he's going to hit it. Yeah. But if things start to go haywire inside, which they often do in the NFL, he has more problems there. But you get him in space, and he's very, very good. Yeah. So the fact that he's top 5 and a little more limited than Judkins, to me, that means they're in a similar tier. They're not. I have Judkins a little bit higher, like in the higher tier, but on the low end of that high tier. Whereas I think I would say that Henderson is maybe on the high end of the tier that's lower. Yeah.
We briefly talked about Tahj Brooks, but I want you to I don't have a super strong opinion about him, so give me a strong opinion about him.
I joke, I nickname him Lemonade because I think he turns lemon plays into lemonade.
That's good.
Because good running backs mitigate losses.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you watch Frank Gore and he annoyed the hell out of everybody who was a fantasy GM late in his career
Mm-hmm.
because Kenyon Drake got blocked and Marlon Mack got blocked. But if you watch their games carefully, you'd see that Frank Gore was giving them an education on how to press a crease, how to set up defenders into the crease and be able to get yardage where most of the time these guys would lose yardage.
Mm-hmm.
And he could do that because he had extraordinary quickness and short area acceleration. And Le'Veon Bell's another guy who was very good at being patient and had that short area quickness that was fantastic and also that acceleration. And he was even slower at Michigan State because he weighed about 15 pounds more.
Yeah, I was going to say,
you know, at that time.
Yeah.
And I was all over both those guys. You know, both those guys I really liked in terms of their skill set. And when I look at Tahj Brooks, his ability to press creases tight and be able to set up defenders into blockers or to be able to avoid unblocked defenders in the backfield and either turn a 7-yard loss into a 2-yard loss or to turn a 5-yard loss into a 15-yard gain.
Mm-hmm.
He does that as well, if not better than anybody in this class. And he can run around you. He can run over you. He was faster than I thought he'd be, at least and I went back and double checked like the miles per hour and different things that I do to track in addition to the 40-yard dash.
Yeah.
But I thought he was going to be a 4.6 guy.
Yeah,
not a 4.52.
It seemed like a lot of people were surprised that he was able to run as fast as he did. Yeah.
Now, he also did the Le'Veon Bell thing, but he was smarter about it. But it makes me laugh because he bristles at the Le'Veon Bell comparisons.
Yeah.
Because I think he's young and he thinks of Le'Veon Bell later in his career.
Yeah.
Off the field
Le'Veon Bell.
Yeah. So he bristles at that. But he did the same Le'Veon Bell thing. He was listed at 230 at Texas Tech.
Yes.
Shows up to the combine 15 pounds lighter. Yeah. He gamed the system well, but he can probably play well at 215.
Yeah.
And at the same time, when he said, I'm more Josh Jacobs, well, to me, Josh Jacobs is the modern day Frank Gore. In terms of how you look at the way they play. So Brooks also is a very good receiver. You don't, at Texas Tech, you're going to get a lot of opportunities, and he could win downfield, tracking the ball over his shoulder, winning jump up and through passes that are like back shoulder fades.
Mm-hmm.
And he could give you the angle routes and the screen passes. And he's just a creative back with excellent processing speed to identify what he needs to do and does it efficiently, but also can do it dynamically when need be. So I've been a fan for about 1.5 years, 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought he was one of those guys that might gain a little bit more ground, and just it turned out he never did among the public. And that's the way it goes.
It could just be this draft class too. I mean, I think that's happening a lot, and we'll get to some more of these guys. I just think it's happening a lot with some of these players where there's just so many good, solid prospects where you could see the ceiling. Maybe that's not super, super obvious like Ashton Genty, but you can see a ceiling with these players, and there's just so many of them that someone has to inevitably be ranked lower, at the end of the day. Yeah,
I mean, running backs there's guys in the 20s in my ranking and below that who still have grades above 80 on my RSP, which means you're a contributor. You can contribute right off the bat. To me, this is like a casting call in Hollywood for veteran lead actors, and you sitting in the room, and it's like, you could be Sean Penn sitting in the room, but so's, Cumberbatch and, a bunch of other guys, Keanu Reeves, whatever. Yeah. And depending on the role, you might go, Keanu Reeves would suck in this particular thing as much as we all love him as a person. But in this particular genre, he'd be great, or Michael Fassbender would not be good in that. But if you talked about him as actors, you look at that room and go, how do I choose? And you realize that NFL teams are doing the same thing. They're looking at, there's all lots of talent. Sean Payton, last year going, with running backs, you can get late round guys and just let them compete because they're all good to some extent.
Right.
What are you looking for in that flavor?
Yep. One player that I do have probably of the I don't want to say higher end, but a guy that a lot of people love, and you seem to like him too. You have him ranked as a top 5 back right now, is Damien Martinez, where I think of all of the players that are sort of in this range, maybe he squeezes into day 2 if a lot of running backs go, but probably day 3 guy. But he's the one that analytically probably concerns me the most from a pass catching perspective, because he had a best season 5.4% reception share, which is pretty low. And if you look at from 2011 to 2022, so I want to give players, my database goes back to 2011. I want to give players at least 3 years of being, eligibility in the NFL. We had 44 running backs get drafted with best season reception shares below 7%. And it was a certain parameter in terms of draft capital. But of those 44, only 2 of them scored more than 13 PPR points per game in one of their first 3 seasons. So my thing is, I've seen a lot of the pros of Martinez as a big bulldozer rusher. My concern would be the pass catching. Is it a valid concern, or are you not as worried about that side because he is that good between the tackles?
Well, I think that if teams are using modeling like you're using it, there may be a concern because they may just write it off before they even begin.
Sure.
But when you do watching the film closely, there's 2 things that I would give a possible, devil's advocate point of view with this so that we can see, because it may turn out the way you're talking. But watching him at Miami, he's not used a lot as a receiver there. When he was, I saw excellent hand-eye coordination to be able to earn the ball, and there was decent route running there as an underneath league receiver. Nothing that was bad there. But then you go back to Oregon State, and what's different is that at Miami, he was the bulldozer who they ran between the tackles a lot. At Oregon State, they like to run toss plays and outside zone, and you see a lot more of the smooth accelerator that comes into play with his game. Now, what happens, though, is that if your rushing offense is based on perimeter running, when you do play action, oftentimes you're rolling to the opposite side of the field, or you're running your running back out of the play. Yeah. So they're not really being featured on the route. They're really the window dressing. And because he was so effective as an outside runner at Oregon State and their main weapon, they wanted the defense just to flock to him so that the quarterback had easy throws. And I think that if it turns out he's a good receiver, we can look back at that and say it was disguised.
Yeah. No, I like that. Like I said, when I'm looking at my prospect, the model, and I'm writing players up and stuff like that, I look at all this from a gray area perspective, with a gray area perspective, right? This isn't this cannot happen. This is I want to know the opposite. I want to know why this happened, or why, the numbers are looking the way that they are, because we know that this is not, it is impossible to just capture everything, right?
As a mutual friend of ours would say, context matters.
Exactly. Speaking of context, I feel like Savion Williams needs some context because no one knows what position he's going to be playing in the NFL. You're really high on him from a running back perspective. Is this like a, easy, low-hanging fruit Cordero Patterson situation, or one of the comps that because I had him as a wide receiver in the model because he went to the combine as a wide receiver, and so whenever it looks at comps, it's going to look at other wide receivers, and Jaylin Hurd was the comp because that's basically the one player that kind of no one really knew and went day 2 and all of that kind of stuff. But what do you see? How do you see teams deploying him? Because for anyone who doesn't know, Savion Williams is 6'5", just a massive, freakish human being who at TCU was getting a lot of work, even just straight up in the backfield, as a running back, and obviously getting more gadgety stuff as well. But there was a legit just running back usage from him there too. So I'm really curious as to how you view him.
Yeah, well, I had a high grade for him as a receiver too. So I originally watched him as a receiver, and then last month I decided, I'm going to grade him as a running back as well.
Yeah.
So grade him as a receiver. I think he can be a starting outside receiver in the NFL who can be very good because he runs decent routes, and he's a good pass catcher. He has some flaws with his hands, but they're not Quentin Johnston-like.
Yeah.
There's various ways you can be flawed with how you attack a football. And Savion Williams didn't have nearly as many flaws. They're much more fixable, or addressable, and he made clutch plays, late, third down, fourth down, red zone, one-on-one, kind of had to squeeze that ball in there, make it difficult, and he won those plays a lot. So I was I was a fan of what I saw from him as a receiver. But then you watch him as a runner, and you're watching like defensive tackles with 20-yard head starts coming down the line in pursuit, and he's trying to pull through like a wrap from a linebacker, and he gets nailed in the side, and the defensive tackle just slides right down his leg and falls to the ground. I mean, like repeatedly seeing him have that contact balance.
He's huge. He's humongous.
Yeah. I mean, Cordero Patterson's 235. Right. So when you look at that and you see what he did, he's one of those guys where you have Quinshon Judkins, and you can say he can run zone, he can run gap, he can do a little bit of everything really well. And then Savion Williams, you go, well, if you put him in an offense where he gets like what Cordero gets, which is toss plays and gap plays, just look, this is the alley.
Yeah.
Do whatever you can to get into that alley, and don't try and do anything too crazy until you get to the second level.
Yeah.
And Williams does that. The crazy thing is that Williams is a very good red zone runner, and he's more than just a look meat, just do this one thing. Mm-hmm. He really can diagnose well within the scope of what they've asked him to do. So he's a savvy runner in that respect. And because he understands, he has good footwork, he understands how to vary pace, and he can break tackles, and then he's got that open field ability. I can see how a team might look at that and say, you know what? Let's figure out a way to use him like we use Cordero Patterson, except that hope if I'm right, and Savion Williams doesn't have the learning issues that Patterson did as a receiver, because my buddy Russ Landy, former NFL scout, said, when he graded Patterson, what they learned when they interviewed him is that he had a very difficult time translating what was on the whiteboard to the field. So he really needed a lot of study time every week. And you had to like give him like very specific set things to do, or else otherwise he just drowned in Norv Turner's offense because they expected him to calculate all these things that he just couldn't do.
That explains the 10th year breakout then.
Exactly. They were trying, they're trying to figure out what to do with him. And then finally, Bill Belichick was able to give some hints of that. And Arthur Smith said, let's give him runs that put him in space, because he was the best space runner I ever graded in 20 years. I mean,
all right, so two other players that are pretty high in the consensus boards that you're lower on, just from rankings perspective, but obviously this is the pre-draft stuff, everything we already prefaced with. Kaleb Johnson and Omarion Hampton. Let's start with Kaleb Johnson. My question to you is, do you have like long speed concerns with him? It's interesting because he goes to the combine, runs probably a 40 that was maybe even a little bit better than some thought that he would run. But, everyone's like, oh, he was a loser at the combine. And I actually don't totally disagree, only because all of the other running backs ran so fast, right? So like within the context of that, because his speed score, when you adjust for weight and stuff, actually is totally fine. Is that a concern for you? And then we'll get to Omarion Hampton after that. Let's just talk about Kaleb Johnson first.
He can flip the field. That's good enough for me. Like if you can get from the 20 to the 20 or the 40, even the 40 to the 30 or something like that, that's good enough. I'm good with that. That's a big play. He does that fine. He's just for me, he's a back who could start right now if you needed him to, and the grade reflects that, even if the ranking doesn't. It's just that he's better in one scheme than any other. So it's like, so most likely he'll rise in my rankings post-draft, because if he landed on a team that was like a Kubiak Stefanski type of McVay type of scheme where you're going to run a lot of wide zone, that's what he does best. But he can run the other schemes okay. He's just not quite as strong. He's not quite as quick twitch as maybe you would want, but he's a smooth runner. He can do everything you're looking for, other than, I would say pass protection needs a little bit of work. Probably what dinged him more than anything was pass protection, and that his speed, for me, speed, the point value might be the difference between might be the difference between 3 to 5 backs on my board. One tier, but still well within starter range. So I'm fine with him. I just, the speed thing didn't really bother me, especially with outside zone.
Yeah. And then Omarion Hampton, I think this is a really interesting case, because if you look at running back since 2011 who got first round draft capital. And I'm going to give you a hypothetical to kind of just think through this, right?
Sure.
We've had 18 of them since 2011. 2/3 of those have given us 16 or more PPR points per game in one of their first 3 years. It's an RB1 season in one of their first 3 years. The guys who didn't were Mark Ingram, who eventually kind of got there, David Wilson, who had to retire early, Rashad Penny, who's obviously was banged up, couldn't stay healthy, Josh Jacobs, who eventually got there. He was always an RB2. It's really just like Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Sony Michel, who were bottom of the first round picks to begin with,
Right.
and definitely had, some flags too. But regardless, my question to you is, you see Hampton a certain way, based on the ranking and based on, your write-up of him. But my question would be, if he does get, because there's a lot of steam about him going in round 1. And
Sure.
if he goes in round 1 and then you see Judkins go to a decent enough spot mid round 2, does that make you say, I'll put Hampton, like, is Hampton good enough in your eyes from a talent perspective to jump a player like Judkins, or are you still more so going to stick to it with Judkins just because round 2 capital obviously still isn't that bad?
I'd say, depending on the team, it's plausible that could happen.
Yeah.
I don't know how likely it will, but it's plausible.
Okay.
With Omarion and Hampton, I mean, certainly he's got good power. He has very good top end speed. But I would say that his top end speed isn't accessed well enough on a regular enough basis that I project it well to go that well in the NFL, because
Gotcha.
he needs a long runway to hit that top speed. Like, think Latavius Murray, like, if he gets into the secondary and he didn't have to make anybody miss or break a tackle, he's going to accelerate past those guys. But if he had to do a lot of work to get there, he's not accelerating past. And Hampton gets jostled a lot in pass pro, more than people realize, and how that's going to project to like NFL defenders. I don't think he's going to be quite as strong of a pass protector as people have him down to be. That said, he's fine he's a fine back who can be a good starter in the league. I just don't see him with the same level of depth of talent overall as some of the other 9 other guys that I see on my list. But it's a good class. But if those 9 other guys weren't there, based on his score, he could have been running back too, just based on the fact that he scored at the level that he did. So he's a good back. He'll probably find a decent fit. They'll probably leverage what he does well. So if Judkins goes to round 3 or round 4, then I'd probably be more likely to give Hampton the nod. If Judkins goes to a good team in the second round, I'd probably still go with Judkins. But Hampton will probably move up. I mean, Hampton would probably move up beyond Damien Martinez if Martinez is like a fifth round pick easily. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to hear. And then you mentioned sort of getting and unlocking that top end speed. Let's talk about Bhayshul Tuten, who watching him, it's you can see the speed on tape for sure.
Yeah.
And he obviously then ran that fast at the combine. It's always good to see that pair up. The crazy thing is that his comps analytically ranged, it was just so wide. It went from Kenneth Walker on the good end to Darrington Evans, on the other. To me, he seems like a high upside player and high upside back. I just don't know if that'll fully be unlocked. And honestly, I'm kind of letting draft capital dictate that to a degree. But you also had a really, really interesting nugget in RSP about fumbling and his fumbling issues and what you kind of look for there. So can you talk about Tuten and talk about that fumbling stat as well?
Yeah, I mean, Tuten, certainly, I agree. He's got that high upside for sure, the speed, the ability to break tackles. Get him in a gap scheme, and I think he does pretty well. But anything else where he has to make more advanced decisions behind the line of scrimmage, that's where I have concerns about him maybe being a little bit slower to develop, but he could get there. It's just, but if there's a reason he stalls out, it'll either be the decision making where it's just hit or miss sometimes, and the fumbling. Because one of the things that I decided to do after a while was, I decided this summer was, let me look at the past 6 years of running backs who've entered the league and look at players who fell below the baseline that I set as you should be able to be on the field with this fumble rate.
Yeah.
And anything lower than that, you're not holding on the ball well enough to ride the ride. And so looking at that baseline number and looking at the number of backs in the past 6 years who and their fantasy results, I found that if you fell below that baseline rate, that only I think it was only 10% of the backs scored at a running back 2 value or higher, and then only 3% scored at a running back as a top 10 running back or higher. So it's a very low outcome based on that group. Now, what I didn't do, and what I probably will do, in the next few weeks when I get ready for this fantasy season a little bit more, is I want to look at the backs who did exceed that expectation.
Yeah.
Who recovered, like a Sony Michel, who had a horrific fumble rate, and while injuries was an issue, his fumble rate was much better in the NFL.
Yeah.
I want to see who was able to start from that bad baseline and get better. And I would bet anecdotally that they had high scores in the RSP. They probably scored above a certain threshold.
Yeah.
So if Tuten scores above that threshold and those other guys did too, it might not be as much of a concern.
Right.
But at the same time, I found what I can't say anecdotally that I've seen that clearly. In fact, I'd say I haven't seen that. So I'd be a little more concerned.
Yeah. I'm going to just go to one more running back, because I know that, we're talking, and I mean, look, if you want to keep going, I'll keep going, because
I'll keep going if you want to.
I'll talk. I will talk all day. Yeah. All right. Well, then let's just get to these guys, because I think that people will want to hear about it. And I just want to pick your brain. Jarquez Hunter was probably the go-to day 3, maybe undrafted. I mean, who knows where he goes, but definitely not day 2 back that my model liked. Are you on the same page with Hunter?
Oh yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah. I love Jarquez Hunter. I was surprised he ranked so low for me at 20th on my board, because that dude has contact balance. He runs with authority. He has excellent speed and quickness. He's one of those players that I believe we're going to look back in a few years and go, that was a gem. That was a gem of a player who you could see it coming, and he just has some things to work out in his game. But I think they're capable. He's kind of the wild card of this draft, if you ask me. He's that little girl with the curl who's got that spunk of the personality where you go, this could go really well or it could go really bad.
Sure.
But I think we're going to see Jarquez Hunter turn into a good back.
Yeah, I mean, that's like that is the perfect late round dart throw, though, in your rookie drafts, right? Like that kind of player. I mean, I wrote about this in the guide, but he really, he was 5th amongst all running backs in this year's class in career avoided tackles per rush, 9th in career explosive run rate, 9th in career yards after contact per attempt. He had a breakout score, which is my more proprietary metric, if you will, of 93.8. So, he didn't get crazy usage as a receiver at Auburn, but it looked like when he did get that opportunity, he made some big plays as a pass catcher when he finally, when they did use him. And it's actually interesting, like it's sort of the way that the model now views like a Kenneth Walker type. Not that they're the same player. I just mean from a receiving perspective, Kenneth Walker also had a pretty low reception share, but Walker's breakout score, which is again new for this year, I changed it up for to it be more focused on receiving. Walker's breakout score was also above 90 because his receiving yards were just so strong when he did get the ball. It's just that they weren't giving him the ball that much. Largely, I think on Walker's end is because he was getting so much work on the ground. But Hunter just seems pretty interesting.
To me, he's in that same body archetype of guys like J.K. Dobbins and Khalil Herbert. And he runs good routes. His hands need a little cleaning up, but again, it's not insurmountable.
Yeah.
But I love the determination. I love the way that he runs at full speed. He can accelerate in the contact. And to me, a good running back does that. And not a lot of guys do that anymore. And at Auburn, I mean, listen, their offense is very limited in terms of the range of things that they ask their players to do, which is why probably a lot of people were down on Bo Nix as they saw the disaster that was there. And I know some scouts who did some work there who were like, they're like bubble screen Bo. That was basically what he was. Right. But when you watch, the receivers didn't do him any favors. And I think this team is kind of like that. Auburn's one of those teams that when I see them, I think of like these just like raw athletes who are just like fantastic athletes across the board for that team. And some of them actually end up being guys that Alabama really wanted.
Yeah.
And they said, no, forget it. I'm never going there. And they're the thorn in Alabama's side. Right. But a lot of them are the guys that like Alabama was like, yeah, we could get someone more refined. And Auburn goes there and they go to Auburn, and Auburn's like got this team of like all athletes, who are great athletes, but the way that they're implemented is a little bit less to be desired sometimes.
Yeah. It's not Alabama and from that perspective. All right, so I need to talk about DJ Giddens too. So you have him at this RB30 ranking, and again, I'm just being loose with rankings. You have him lower than where consensus generally is. I have to say, analytically, he looks really, really interesting and pretty decent. Like really good size adjusted speed and a decent enough receiving profile. There's certain filters that, I always preface this, but like whenever I'm like filtering and saying like, this is the thing that I get really annoyed about whenever I see it on Twitter, when people like go to StatHead and they say, okay, find all the players who hit X, Y, and Z marks, and they use the player that they're trying to prove to be in a certain grouping and tier. They use that player's numbers, which means everyone else in that query is going to be better than that player, right? And so I did that a little bit with Giddens, and I said, let's have some fun with numbers. And like he ended up being in a grouping with some really good running backs. And so my question to you is like, give me the bear case in Giddens. I know that you wrote a little bit about his inconsistencies. It seemed like where you could see the flashes, but it wasn't just there enough. Is that the big thing with him?
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to like Giddens. Yeah. Like I watched the first game and said, oh, I like where this kid could be. Like I like where it can happen, and it just never got there for me.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is that right now he doesn't really press creases deep enough to set up blocks. And a lot of guys who don't have the patience to get within 1 to 2 steps of a blocker end up being the Kenyon Drakes of the world, where it's like they bounce everything too much. They become tentative in what they do. And maybe they have a good season because they get set up in a scheme where, it works out, but they don't last. I think his time speed's a little better than what we routinely see on the field. And I think that his acceleration just doesn't match his top gear. The burst is starter caliber, but I think that you see the way he processes information is a little slow. Maybe that gets faster, but I find that when you're working between the tackles, if you don't have a fast processor now, it's hard to get there.
Yeah.
That was CJ Prosice's problem.
Yeah.
So he didn't have a really fast processor. He had everything that's going on there. So Giddens to me is that guy that, you want players to be thermostats rather than light switches. And I would say that, Giddens' game feels more like a light switch, and you got to find some duct tape to put over that knob so it stays on the on position. He's kind of, if it works out, he could be a faster Melvin Gordon, which could be really good.
Right.
You know, but I kind of feel right now his attack, his pacing, how he just finishes in all areas of, as a runner just isn't quite there. And his pass, it was one of those things where like he didn't have one special thing, but he had multiple things where you're like, if he fixes this, if he fixes this, and next thing you know, I'm like, he's got 10 things to fix, and some of them are easy, and it might get him to a contributor level where he's like a good third down back, or you can put him in as a change of pace, and you like what you see. But is he going to get all the way there? And I just have doubts that he's going to be able to fix all those things.
And then the last one I want to talk about is RJ Harvey. I don't have like a massive stance on him either way. The model dings him because he is an older back. And I sometimes think that, especially when folks are looking at like production and using that as a proxy to evaluate these guys, there's not enough like weight being put in on the age side because he has extra time to get some production, like that you have to at least factor that in. But what do you see from him to have him lower than, because some people, like I've seen RJ Harvey as high as like RB4 or 5 in this class from some people. So I'm curious where you're at with him.
Well, I mean, I would say this again, it comes down to ball security. His ball security is on the cusp of unacceptable. So if he had, earned a better ball security score, he would have been at least in a rotational starter tier, which is where, above 80% or 80 points on my score checklist, which is where a lot of these backs where I've talked about, like Caleb Johnson and Omarion Hampton and guys like that he'd be in that tier. But he's just below that tier because he's got some decent receiving skills again, for the most part. You love the Tariq Cohen type of quickness and explosion to his game, and you can see how he makes people miss. But to me, he's somewhere between like Tariq Cohen and Ito Smith in terms of what you're looking for. He could contribute, but you're not going to get much from him as a pass protector. He takes too many chances sometimes trying to bounce things outside that won't work as well in the NFL. It'll work once or twice in the preseason. People are getting super excited. It might even work early in the season. Defenses adjust a little bit. They ask him to be more disciplined. And then you're like, can you hold on to the ball a little bit better, my man? If he can do this. So it's there for the taking for him, but he's got some things to improve in it. The biggest thing is ball security. If he does that, maybe you're looking at him as your third down back or your space back who can give you big plays. And he may still do that now.
Yeah.
It's just that, is he going to move beyond that and say, yeah, he was worth being one of the top 4 or 5 running backs in his class?
Yeah. From a comp perspective on my end, he drew a high end comp. I mean, obviously this is from a prospecting perspective, but then we saw what he did last year, but the high end one was Chase Brown. And then Jordan Todman and Anthony McFarland were the other two. So it's like, I'm not quite to where others are with Harvey, and just kind of I'm not really either way with him. So it's good to hear your take on that. All right, let's get to this wide receiver class. I know that we've been chatting a lot. I'm loving this though, and
me too.
Yeah,
and
good. Love picking your brain.
We don't write all this stuff so that we can just sit there and be quiet about it, right?
That's what I'm saying. Exactly. All right, let's look at this wide receiver class though. On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate this class?
Somewhere between a 5.5 and a 6.5.
Okay.
And the reason being is that last year's class was probably more of an 8 or 9.
Yeah.
And some people might say it was higher than that, but I think that what we're seeing happening, I'm noticing with my scoring, is that over the past 3 years, I have like the franchise caliber tier, which is where Jamar Chase and Malik Neighbors belong. Then you have the starter tier, and that's where guys like Malik, where like Marvin Harrison and Ladd McConkey belong, and a lot of guys were in that starter tier last year. But then there's this contributor tier, which is basically there's the contributor and the rotational starter tiers. Those are the tiers where you get these guys who in 2 or 3 years you think maybe they can grow enough to become a starter or a high-end contributor on an NFL team that might have fantasy value. Mm-hmm. That tier is like the big center of the bell curve.
Sure.
Okay. And it seems to be growing more and more each year for me over the past 3 years. It's expanding more. Now, proportionately, the higher tiers are getting a little bit larger too, but they're proportionate to the bell curve, in terms of how that's going. And what I'm noticing is my theory beyond that isn't that I'm scoring any different.
Can I give you what I think it is?
Yeah, you tell me.
Is it age? Is it experience with these wide receivers and them sticking around a little bit longer, maybe learning the game a little bit more? And then from your perspective, you're viewing them and watching them as they are, and they're maybe not as inexperienced as they otherwise would be.
That may be part of it. It may well be part of it. And part of what you mentioned is probably where I'm going to expand a little bit more.
Okay.
Is that because of more 7-on-7 football, more flag football, more coaches at the position who these guys get access to early on, because now the college game is a professional environment in terms of money.
Sure.
Now you can afford to pay some of these coaches.
Yeah.
And in high school, maybe you can get some of these guys and you start. So these guys come in, or in the NFL, they know more techniques about how to release from the line of scrimmage, know more techniques about how to run routes. The thing is that they know enough that they've got more tools in their toolbox. And so when I'm scoring, I'm going, well, I'm seeing that, I'm seeing this, I'm seeing that. And so they're getting some value in my evaluation that they know the technique and sometimes perform it reasonably well enough to get results. But they're not quite, but they're also showing like they're like the young carpenter who gets the toolbox and he's got the brand new tool set that like maybe his dad bought him or something, and then he comes to the job site and he doesn't know how to use any of those tools. Right. And there's some old man there who looks like he's about to keel over, but he can use a hammer like 6 different ways that you've never even heard of. And he's getting and you're sore that by the end of the day, and he looks like he barely made the effort. And he's just like doing stuff. You're like, this should be on YouTube somewhere, And so that's what happens in the league. Is I think what's happening is that the now I have more guys than ever who could be good, but the likelihood of them getting there is low because they don't have any real craft to how they're delivering it. And in order to get to the higher tiers, my criteria says you have to show the craft to win these certain things. To get into the middle tiers, it shows you have to demonstrate at least a certain number of skilled movements that are used to win these types of things. So I think that's the deal, is that the baseline level of skill to be a contributor there's more players meeting that baseline, but they're not getting over that.
Interesting.
It's kind of like kids now. Like a good example, I used to work at University of Georgia at their business school, and I would talk to professors and academic counselors, and they would say, she's like, the kids are changing nowadays because of the phones. And she said the phone, and she's, I know it's gonna sound like old woman shaking your fist but the ability to work together in groups, the soft skills, they're different than what they were generations before. Like you're in my generation where they taught soft skills more. Right. And now, so like these kids know about more than we did based on the sheer volume of information. But the soft skills to write an email, to interact with people politely, to, and I'm not saying all kids, because there's some wonderful kids out there or younger people out there from these generations who are fantastic. But what she said is I'm seeing a rise in people who are not getting above outside that bell curve, who more and more people, the social skills aren't strong enough to do what they're going to need to do to advance. Even though they have a higher baseline of knowledge. Yeah.
That's really, I love that analogy. It's a really good comparison and interesting to think about too. So let's look at these wide receivers. I was very, very satisfied seeing Luther Burden as your wide receiver 1, because I'll tell you what, I even wrote this in the prospect guide this year. I said if the Zap model had a baby, it'd probably name it Luther. It loves Luther Burden. I would say, at least analytically, and I didn't watch like every single season for all of these players, mind you, but like analytically, Luther Burden's sophomore season is the best age-adjusted season from a production standpoint of any wide receiver in this class, and I say that pretty confidently. Now, the downside is if you look at the usage, just simply the usage, he was used basically as like a third-year Wan'Dale Robinson. Like a lot of manufactured stuff, a lot of screens, a lot of stuff behind the line of scrimmage, a lot of slot work. Got some. He wasn't as prolific of a rusher as Wan'Dale was as a prospect, but he did get that rushing production, which to me is a good thing, not a bad thing, to get the rushing production and stuff. But the model loves him because the model is not looking at the exact areas that these players are getting looks. And I also think that there might be, this is me sharing something that I haven't fully fleshed out and really talked through, but I think there's in the analytics world, I think there's a little bit of a overstating of archetypes, the way that like, Burden is used this way, and that's how Wan'Dale Robinson was used, that's how Rondale Moore was used, that's how Kadarius Toney was used, and Paris Campbell was used, and therefore that's going to be the way that Burden will be used at the next level. To me, I see it more so as, and this is where I want you to just go nuts with your Burden take, I see it more as, okay, this might create a larger range of outcomes for a player like him. It does not mean that we need to full on fade the dude because he's just the next Paris Campbell. To me, it's okay. We recognize that this has happened in the past before with some players, but there's also other things like, again, Burden's production in general was way better than most of those guys, maybe aside from Robinson, but he's also 25 pounds heavier than Wan'Dale Robinson. He's got 4 inches more, he's 4 inches taller than Wan'Dale Robinson. And there's, to me, like, this is the other thing I have to throw out there. I was texting our mutual friend, Matt Harmon, while I'm writing the prospect guide. And I always liked, when I get the comps of certain players, I like to just text him and say, does this make sense? Like, is this logical for what? And the Burden comp that came out, this was back in early February, was Brandon Ayuk. And I saw an RSP and I saw in reception perception that Brandon Ayuk was the guy that you guys were referencing. And I'm like, this is coming together and making me feel a little bit better about, like, because again,
I've never heard anybody mention him, so that's great. That's great to hear.
It was so wild because, again, when you're looking at this stuff from an analytics perspective, an analytical perspective, and you're finding comps and such, your comps are going to not be so one-to-one in terms of the exact type of player that you project per se. Like there will be instances where a slot player has a comp that is more perimeter and like barely played the slot in college, for instance, right? Or, you were talking about running backs before. You get like a power back versus a guy who's better at zone in a zone scheme.
Yeah, I mean, there's guys who are the size of a cornerback and guys who made it who are the siise of a defensive tackle.
Right.
I mean,
right.
What position has that range of body types?
Exactly. So like I'm getting like a wide, DJ Moore was one, of course, because DJ Moore is a very easy, like, he was productive. He played a lot more on the perimeter, and he didn't have the same kind of usage as Burden did, but very similar size, very similar like overall high level production. But then the Ayuk one came out, and then you had Ayuk too, and Harmon had Ayuk, and it's the only, like, I have not seen the Burden to Ayuk comp, so I was just like, chef's kiss, this is unbelievable. I love it. I need to hear you talk about Luther Burden.
Well, I laugh when I hear about Wan'Dale Robinson. I mean, like, if Luther Burden's Wan'Dale Robinson, I'm John Coltrane. That's basically, I would love that to happen. I'd hate it for Burden, but I would love that to happen for me selfishly. But when you look at Burden's game, the other thing about Brandon Ayuk that I find interesting is that I don't have numbers to support this, but just from eyeballing it, I remember evaluating Ayuk and going, he runs slants, he runs crossing routes and over routes, and then they do play action deep and screen passes.
That's right.
He's not much of a route runner, or he wasn't used a lot that way.
Exactly.
But he became one of the better route runners in the league. And when I watched Luther Burden, it was easier than evaluating Ayuk for me. Because when I watched him, I know that the volume of plays may not have been there for him as a route runner, but the routes that he did run that were underneath where you required a hard break, they were sharp, they were technically sound. When you needed a speed break where they needed to be flat so a defender who was trailing you couldn't cut off the ball, they were flat. You could see that one of the things that he had that was a very high-end skill was down the field. He could work his way down the field when the quarterback needed to break the play and abandon it and go off script. And he could bait defenders into one direction and uncover late, and the quarterback and him be on the same page. These are the types of things that Ladd McConkey did really well. And when you saw it with Justin Herbert last year, there are a few plays where he uncovered in the end zone and Herbert already had the ball coming out just as he uncovered. Like, that type of communication with a quarterback is really what you need, and he has that ability. So the route running didn't bother me. The route running was good. When they asked him to go work vertical, tracks the ball very well.
Yeah.
And then you have what are called jump up and throughs, which are the technique that wide receiver coaches use to talk about when you have a back shoulder play or an underthrown ball, even not that's unintentional. most guys that people get really excited about, they do these very athletic catches like George Pickens, where they like Pickens has gotten better at this, but at Georgia, you would see him like leap late. And that meant that he had to extend and open his chest. And he's like doing the Nestea plunge or the Odell Beckham way back here. And the defender has access to his entire body at the catch point to defend the ball. And it looks unbelievable, but it gets you, but you're going to lose in the NFL doing that more often than not. You want to be able to time it early enough that you can attack the ball with a leap that goes straight up in the air. And now your back is to the defender and you're boxing them out and having control of the ball. And the guys who do that well early are few. And Luther Burden does that very well. He's a good tracker. He doesn't track it late. And that means not only does it mean that he catches the ball undefended, he also catches it and can land on his feet and maybe get a little more yardage afterwards and have control. So overall, good route runner, very strong in all the ways that you mentioned. And it just was not as often seen. But when you watch something and you see it happen multiple times, it may only be 3 or 5, but the detail is rich and it's consistent and it's literally technical things that coaches teach.
Yeah.
And you see it perform to the letter. You go, I've seen enough. Yeah. That's enough for me. I know that he knows what he's doing. It's like someone who's had if you've taken any public speaking classes, which I have not, obviously, but if you've taken them and you've had and you've been trained at, say, Toastmasters, I'm sure you can pick out someone who got trained at Toastmasters to be a public speaker, and you can see the techniques. And if you don't, you just look at him and go, that guy's just really smooth at how he's just he's got good presence as a speaker, and he's got a good control of what he does. And I think that's the thing with Burden, is that you only have to see because of the technically rich details of his game, you don't have to see it all the time. You just have to see it enough to go, yeah, that's there.
So you, from a projection standpoint, you see him inside out in the NFL, or do you think that he'll be more slot in the NFL?
I think he can do both. Yeah. So I don't think it matters at this stage. It just, we'll see where he lands,
right.
For that to go. The only thing I've heard, and again, this is the stuff that neither you nor I can really put any stake in, is rumor that he's a bit of a wide receiver in the sense of a personality.
Yep.
Which is the risk for all these guys.
Yep. I heard the same thing, and obviously that's it's something that we should at least have in the back of our mind, especially if he's, to me, that's a does the draft capital reflect it kind of thing too? Is it something that teams, a lot of teams here, and then he falls and falls and falls. If you look at like mock draft data, he went from, the end of April mock draft data, right before the draft data, is actually pretty predictive, versus actual draft capital. I have not tested like December or November, mock draft. I don't have access to it, but it is interesting that Burden in like December-ish, that time frame, was like a pretty locked in, like top 12-ish player in this draft, like going in that range. And now he's slipping out of the first round pretty consistently. And maybe it's the off the field stuff, or maybe, it's people seeing more. I don't know. Or maybe it's groupthink. I have no clue, but it's at least something to keep an eye on.
I'll say this. I'll end it with this. You mentioned Matt Harmon. Fran Duffy was talking to me, the former Eagles producer who does all those wonderful film reviews for the organization. And now he's out on his own doing his work. And I would recommend people to check out what he's doing. But Fran texted me and goes, I've seen some of your Luther Burden videos on X, and I've been studying them. And I keep thinking to myself, what the heck are people seeing that they don't think this guy is the goods? He goes, I don't see it. And I'll give you this. And he goes, so when I watched, I wondered what you thought. And I said, he's probably going to be my number one wide receiver.
Yeah.
And he said, good. Cause I can't understand what people are seeing that's not there. Yeah. And I will give Fran credit for this. I remember the last time we talked about a receiver like that, he was really high on Amon-Ra St. Brown. So Fran's got a good eye, and he understands the game. And so I think, that's a good one too.
Love to hear that. Travis Hunter, you have him at 2. I don't necessarily want to get into where he's going to play, all that kind of. I just want to talk about him as a receiver, because I had a really tough time from an analytic perspective, because everybody in the world is on social media right now saying that this is one of the best prospects that they've ever watched before. And then I look at the numbers and of course they threw a lot at Colorado. So he had these like gaudy, junior season numbers, like raw totals and stuff like that. But the predictive metrics, whether you're looking at like yards per route run, receiving yards per team pass attempt, and you adjust that for age, because he didn't have massive production until last year. When you adjust for all of that, he has an okay enough profile, but like when you compare that to other first round wide receivers, it's more, and this is not how I would rank him per se, but like it's like 15th, 20th percentile stuff, against other first round wide receivers that we've seen. Now, the way that I've explained that away in a way is that, he's playing 90 snaps a game. He's playing both corner and wide out. He's in the corner rooms, during the week or what have you, and not necessarily getting typical reps, at wide receiver. So I can't really I have to recognize this is a very unique prospect. But what do you see? Do you think that he is as good as other people are saying? Like Harmon came out with the reception perception chart, of course, and it's all green and everyone's losing their minds over it. But he'll be the first to say that's not the end all, I'm just curious if you see him the way that the majority of people see him.
I would say if there's a player that I should have been a little bit more bearish on, it would probably be him. Interesting. Because he was on the border of a couple of tiers as a route runner and pass catcher in some ways that he could have been lower on my board, probably. But I saw enough that I felt like he earned the grade that I gave him, which is a franchise caliber grade. He's my number 2 guy.
Yeah.
And it's above 90, which is a really very good score. For context, I think Malik Neighbors was like a 94, 95. Jamar Chase was in that range as well. Marvin Harrison, who I wasn't as high on as most people, was still in the 90s,
Sure.
So yeah. It's a good score, but there's still things to learn. He's going to start right away if they use him as a receiver fully. But I would say this, I think he does some incredible job with finding the ball, but I think he leaves his feet unnecessarily for targets over his head, which can cause some issues with, earning the ball against tight coverage, with getting yards after the catch in an NFL environment where it's going to be tougher to do that. And then I would say he's also someone who, at the line of scrimmage when getting pressed, people love to talk about, well, he's a corner. He knows what to do, so he's just going to reverse engineer that, and he's going to be really good. I see that he doesn't always make the best choices he should and gets pinned to the boundary more often than I would expect from a guy who actually knows how to pin people to the boundary.
Yeah, true.
So it's easy to be like on one end of the spectrum, and then you now have to play a different instrument, and now you're like, oh, you know what? This instrument's harder than I thought it was.
Yeah.
It's got its own challenges.
Yeah.
So I think for him, obviously, I think he can play.
Yeah.
I just think that if there's some issues, is that, he has a little bit of suboptimal attack for the ball that can, in tight coverage, it might not be as good, just like Marvin Harrison, who in the wrong environment, and they just say, we're going to make you a jump ball receiver. And now you're dropping passes or not winning the ball. And everybody's like, he's not as good as everybody said he was, because you're putting him in that isolated role. That could happen for him. Or if they just say, yeah, we're going to make you Mecole Hardman. And you could say, well, yeah, you're basically putting, Ritz-Carltons on Baltic Avenue. But because of the property value, you still can't charge Ritz-Carlton rates basically on where you are. People aren't showing up to stay in that hotel because the neighborhood sucks.
Yeah.
So that could happen to Hunter, but I'd say yes, there's a chance he can be as good as people are saying.
Yeah.
I'm not quite there, but I'm not like down on him either.
Yeah, it's hard to just be like, no, it can't happen when we know he's a special player.
Yeah.
But like that's kind of where I'm at with him overall. All right, I got to talk about Matthew Golden. Golden is probably the poster child of what I was talking about earlier from a draft rising perspective, where if you look at his charts from like December, he was like a 5th round pick for people. And then obviously now, you had that final month of the season. And he overtook Isaiah Bond, in that offense, and he was sort of the primary go-to guy, down the stretch for them. From an analytical perspective, we don't see a ton of hits with this kind of production profile, of course, because he didn't do much until the final, tail end of that season. And, he did a little bit of Houston, but not a ton, especially when you adjust just for age and program strength, what have you. But I will say one of the analytical comps that popped out for him was Ladd McConkey. And so there is at least some of that like potential upside there. I don't want to write him off at all for obvious reasons, but where are you at with Golden? You have him right now at wide receiver 3.
Yeah, I liked him. I liked his route running. I felt like that he's good at attacking the football. He makes the type of technically sound plays that you want to see at the catch point and with breaks. He's got very good quickness and body control. And he reminded me of a Ladd McConkey type of player, Jayden Reed.
Yeah.
I mean, the same kind of role and function. And I think that he can beat you in multiple ways in multiple roles. And the thing is that maybe a player like him, because he's got that utility the way that he has, that he probably didn't get maybe the type of role that would lead to the value that maybe a model would show.
Yeah,
I don't know. That's what, but I could see how that might be the thing with him. He's a matchup player in my eyes, a guy who you can put one-on-one and say the ball's coming to you, figure it out. And I think that he can do that. And I think a lot of people are kind of getting scared off of him because they see a Mecole Hardman type.
Yeah.
But again, Mecole Hardman couldn't catch in tight coverage or in contested situations. He was not a sharp route runner. He was just a very good athlete who could catch the ball reasonably well at the pro standard, but not well enough. So to me, I think again that's a poor comp. It's almost as bad as Luther Burton to Wan'Dale Robinson.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. The Hardman, I would agree. Like, I think Golden's a much, even analytically, even with like the weird production profile and the weird, even just, we could say usage because they weren't targeting him at a high rate. He looks better. I mean, Hardman was like red flag galore from an analytical perspective.
And I don't know about you, but from what I observe of Texas, they seem to be a very, high-powered football organization, but seems to throw everything up there to see what sticks because they seem to be a very inconsistent offense.
Yeah.
That was like, this isn't working. Let's overreact to this. Let's overreact to that.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that's part of it. And also Isaiah Bond is another guy I heard who is maybe not, has a little bit of that wide receiver diva thing going on.
Yeah. Steve P and Sam Monson were talking about Isaiah Bond, who we'll get to now, with off the field issues, and Steve mentioned that he is on the Jermaine Burton spectrum in terms of it being potentially that bad. We know, in these situations it can go better. Players can change. You can your mentality can shift. But with Burton, obviously it went the wrong direction last year. You could argue that's the main reason why, things went the way that they went for him. But you have Bond right now at wide receiver 4. And I have to say, my prospect, the Zap model liked Bond because, I think that if you look at the production and from like a raw perspective, it doesn't look like that fantastic. But again, it adjusts for program strength, it adjusts for age. Sophomore year production is usually pretty telling. And when you adjust that Alabama production for age and for program strength, like it starts to look a lot better. And he also, did things in non-typical wide receiver. Like he was getting rushing work and stuff like that, like getting end around type stuff, and wasn't just simply playing the wide receiver position, which is a signal of talent. If a coach is trying to get them the ball, he's probably a good playmaker. So what do you see with Bond? Is he just a field stretcher at the next level, or do you think there could be more there?
No, I think he's a very good route runner, actually. He's another one where at the top of his stems, he accelerates into the top of that stem and then breaks back towards the quarterback or across the field with very good route technique. So he uses that vertical skill like a bully pulpit to be able to dictate his other routes. And that's something you want to see. On top of that, he can catch the ball over the middle. He can be a tough receiver in that realm. He has a couple of areas where maybe he clap attacks or doesn't see the ball as well as he should, but they're minor and isolated that I don't think are going to be massive problems for him overall. And that acceleration that he has is there's not a receiver in this class who you watch the acceleration with the naked eye and the first time you look at it and go, oh yeah, that's a gear.
Yeah.
Like, and he has that. So I think overall, like guys that I considered him to be, in the range of like someone who I didn't really compare him to, but I could see how like Jaylen Waddle is kind of in that realm of, but I thought T.Y. Hilton, I thought, the tier he'll never attain is probably Isaac Bruce. But like guys like that, he's like, if Marvin Mims actually had like enough wide receiver tools in his toolbox that he knew how to use, and Sean Payton didn't have to like retrofit him, that he might be Isaiah Bond. So if Bond can figure it out. I mean, like I love Burton last year, but I don't grade off field.
Sure. Yeah, I like Burton too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you can see the flashes, like when he's on the field and he's doing what he's supposed to do, you're like, oh yeah, I can see why this kid's good.
Yeah.
But then you also hear the stories and go, yeah, let's hope and pray that he grows up.
Yeah, I think draft capital will go a long way for Bond because of that, and there's a recency bias now with Burton. So if a team does go after and get Bond, then we know we'll feel a little bit better if he is a round 2 or late round 2 and into round 3 kind of player as opposed to him just falling and falling and falling. All right, Tet McMillan, he is now that Golden's kind of surging, but Tet McMillan's been right there with him as the consensus wide receiver 1. I've had some concerns because people have said that he's Drake London. I've seen, like, in my opinion, Drake London was a better prospect. I've had Tet in more of like the Cortland Sutton mold, or T. Higgins to a degree. Where are you at with Tet? I see, you have him wide receiver 5, which is technically lower than where consensus has him.
For sure. I came around on Tet a little bit more, but for a while, like the way I score, what usually happens is I find all the little nitty gritty details before I see all the broad stroke stuff that gets their score higher. Yeah. So what can happen is, or it just all comes together early. Like it just depends on how detail rich each rep is,
Yeah.
So with Tet, for a while I would have said to you, yeah, Cortland Sutton is a really good comp for that. And I could see how if it doesn't work out for him really well, he's like what Cortland Sutton was before Sean Payton got here. But I think I see him as probably a better inside out receiver than I see him as an outside guy, though I think he can do it. And I like your mentioning of T. Higgins and Mike Williams type of players who can win the ball. He can win the ball, and he has a great skill with that. I do think that there's some potential there that if he can get better with his releases and have a better plan before the snap to know what he needs to do to earn that separation, I think that he has enough there to do well. And he does clap attack a lot of targets that I don't want to see a guy do, which is what Cortland Sutton was a master at. He is a clap attacker for sure, where he fights the ball more often, but he gets away with it.
Yeah.
But I would say he's probably more on the range of what I saw Nico Collins was coming out. I think that there's potential for him to grow into what Nico Collins has become.
Yeah.
And so that could be excellent. He's definitely a guy that I think can start right now, but I do think that it would be best if he was opposite another good receiver. If he's going to have to be the main man right now, it might take him a couple years to really develop, and you better hope that there's like a veteran on the team that can be helpful to point him in the right direction about routes and separation.
Yeah. Emeka Egbuka, you have a wide receiver 9. Do you see him as sort of just being a decent slot at the next level. One of the comps that popped for me is probably one of the closer ones within the database was Robert Woods. I think others have said that as well with Egbuka, but is there a hesitation from a ceiling perspective, like in terms of production at the next level, fantasy production with Egbuka, if he's more stapled to the slot, if you will?
I think the upside of him being like a high-end wide receiver 1 in fantasy or even a top 12 guy on a regular basis, I think that's too high of an expectation for him.
Yeah.
I know that there are people say, go look at his past tape, and you're going to see he's a lot more versatile on the outside. And I think he can be, a Jackson Smith and Jigba type of talent.
Right.
I've had some colleagues say that. I didn't see that. I saw more of he's at his best in space. He's at his best on slow developing routes, working over the middle of the field, and a lot of crossers and over routes and things like that to get downhill. I think it's just that maybe he's in the same city of Puka Nacua, but not in the same neighborhood.
Yeah.
In terms of, he doesn't always use the best attack of the ball. And that means that when he's in tight coverage, he's going to fight the ball more, end up in situations where he loses it. He has, his timing routes lack sharp detail. So he's one of those guys that just, again, if he's not getting clean separation off the line and he's going to have to win in a tight environment, I don't think that's the strength of his game.
Yeah.
So he'll do it, but he's not going to do it well enough that a team's going to go, that's our number one receiver. And on 3rd and 15, when everyone knows it's coming to, it's going to go to him. That's not the guy we want it coming to.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Makes sense. All right. The last wide receivers I want to ask you about. Again, I'm going to reference Harmon again because Harmon came out with his Jayden Higgins route running profile, and it was all red. And then everyone freaked out, and so he had. And I'm gonna, for the record, Harmon's coming on the show in a couple weeks to do our yearly wide receiver discussion. For me, Higgins was actually the guy who most closely analytically looked like Nico Collins, but he also had like a Cedric Tillman-y. You could put Keon Coleman in there as well, from just an analytical perspective. And then Harmon came out and did say that he sees Higgins as more of that power slot, which is what he put Keon Coleman in last year, and I think rightfully so after seeing what Coleman did, after year one. But then there's also Jaylin Noel in that same offense at Iowa State, who I really liked. I just a lot of versatility. His top comp for me for Jaylin Noel was actually Randall Cobb. Just again, all analytics based, but someone who, Jaylin Noel was so interesting because he had 1 year where his ADOT was like 3 yards. And then he has last year where he's getting down the field more frequently than Jayden Higgins was. And he played all over the place. He played special teams. He was getting some rushing work, like that kind of dynamic. And then obviously he just destroyed the combine. Like from an athletic testing standpoint, he was, not that I cared that much about it at wide receiver, but he was a freak athlete. And so to me, Jaylin Noel is just really interesting because he seems very dynamic, can do a lot of different things. Higgins seems like maybe the more prototypical X that would be in this class. If you could find one guy, maybe that would be the guy that could just be that. But do you see similar things with McMillan where Higgins would just be more of that, like play more in the slot than people would realize just based on the size and the general profile?
I think that might be ways that they want to get him open early in his career.
Yeah.
Because sometimes his footwork is really sharp when it's releasing against defenders. And sometimes you can tell that he doesn't know what he wants to do and it's tentative and he's running in mud.
Yeah.
So it's really more of about having a plan and understanding what the plan should be and developing that. It's funny how you have more of a Nico Collins for him and you had more of a T. Higgins for Tet.
Yeah,
I have more of a T. Higgins, Mike Williams.
There you go.
So it's funny how that goes. But we're at least in the same ballpark. Like, it's just a range of a spectrum.
Yeah, but these guys also, to me, like, these are the guys for the most part that are, like, sort of the let's see if they can develop into true X's at the NFL level. There's not a ton of this archetype in this year's class.
Yeah, if there's one, I'm going to talk about him later. But in what we're going to talk about a little bit later on here. But
Yeah.
I would say, with Higgins, I think that he's someone that what he's doing, what he can't do, he should get better at. And when you see that when he knows what he's doing, he's quick, he's got that explosive ability, and he can use his size, strength, length, and quickness in those areas. You feel better about projecting that the areas where he doesn't do it well, because it's just a matter of learning the technique, as opposed to not having any technique whatsoever.
So not if, but when.
Good way to put it.
And then with Jaylin Noel, do you think that there's a possibility that, that this is like an Amon-Ra St. Brown-ish situation where he's that dynamic and could maybe play a little bit more on the perimeter? Because he's pretty heavily used in the slot at Iowa State. Now, obviously, you're playing with Higgins, and that's going to force your hand a little bit. But did you see enough that he could be more than just that at the next level?
Yeah, I think so. You comp Matthew Golden to Robert Woods, and I would say Robert Woods and Amon-Ra St. Brown in their prime are probably very similar types of players. You could put them outside. You used them a lot in the slot. It's just that Woods languished with Rex Ryan in Baltimore for a little while.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not Baltimore, but in Buffalo for a little while.
Yeah.
And then with Noel, I think it's a similar type of thing. I have like what people hope Johnny Mechie would become. I think he's the discount Matthew Golden. Like he's the guy that might give you just as good or better of a career than Golden, but you can get later.
Yeah.
And so, excellent stop-start skill, reaccelerates really well. I've seen him work well in the middle of the field. He had a compelling young quarterback for a year in Hunter Deckers at Iowa State, who got banned because he decided to go on to DraftKings that his dad put on an account for $15, and then he played a parlay and ended up getting banned from the NCAA and was at Iowa Western last year. But he was featured on ESPN, and I didn't study him for the RSP because it was a little late, but I watched enough to see if I should have studied him, and I definitely should have studied him.
Yeah.
He definitely would have been at least in the top 7 to 9 of my 12 quarterbacks. There, he could fit the ball into coverage really well, and so he made a lot of pro caliber throws. And Noel was on the receiving end of many of those, so you can tell that he's got the skill to operate in traffic. And the only thing that I would say with him that he's got to work on, and it's got to get straightened out pretty early, or he's going to lose playing time, is that sometimes he doesn't know when to stop and settle and when to continue running. He gets confused by the cut. That means he's not sure whether he's running against zone or man.
Yeah.
And he and the quarterback got to be on the same page with that.
Yeah. All right, we've been talking a lot. You've been talking a lot. I'll just give you one more question, and this is very open-ended, so you can give any take that you haven't been able to give throughout this, talking about these running backs and wide receivers. We're not going to get to the quarterback and tight end stuff totally. But if there's one potential like late round, maybe undrafted pick at any of these fantasy football related positions that you think more people should be aware of, give me that player.
I'm going to give you Isaiah Nair of Nebraska.
Okay. Wow, nice. Okay.
Yeah, he's about 6'4", 220, somewhere around that range, around a 4.4 40 at the combine. Now, you would have heard of him if he didn't tear an ACL at Texas when Steve Sarkisian recruited him out of Wyoming, where he was destroying everybody at Wyoming. And then he came to Texas, and Sarkisian was preseason going, listen, I've got a receiver tandem in Isaiah Nair and Xavier Worthy. We're gonna rule our division with these guys.
Yeah.
And then he tore an ACL, and then it took him a while to get back on track. But he's a big receiver who plays to his size. He has good speed, who can win vertically. He wins over the middle just fine. He can run after the catch. He would have been much higher on my board if I could have seen instances in all the tape that I watched, and I watched everything I could find, and I had access to all his film. I watched it all. And I didn't see any instances where he had to like navigate traffic, where he had to show patience or creativity, or where he had to run through people, or anything that would have given him a higher score. Because I would presume you could, when you evaluate people, like I do, the question you have to answer is, do I presume that he can do it and give him credit, or do I say you've got to prove it because I haven't seen it?
Right.
And I've gone for the you've got to prove it because I haven't seen it, because I don't want to project things that aren't there to that degree.
Right.
So I didn't see stuff. He could have easily been a top 12 receiver on my board.
Yeah.
But he was like 20th or 21st or something like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up being like a 5th or 6th round pick or undrafted, and people go, who is that? But when you watch his game, the other thing too is I think he wanted to raise his draft status because he tried very hard to get another year and so he could come out next year and get another year of eligibility. And he went back and forth on it. And then I think he ran at the combine and did well. And he said, "I'll screw it. I'll go."
Yeah. That's a good name. I feel like that is not a name that I've seen get thrown out. I mean, I wrote his profile up and stuff, but I have not seen that name get thrown out there. So I like the uniqueness of it. That's great. It's awesome.
Cool.
Waldman, man, this was awesome. I mean, I love like. This is now it's officially a yearly thing, right?
Yes, I hope so.
Yeah, did it last year, now did it this year. Let everyone know where they can find RSP, everything they get, and where they can find you.
Sure, you get a pre-draft and post-draft publication. The pre-draft is humongous. You can, if the beast is King Kong, then the RSP is Godzilla.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
I don't know who won in those, and we're not trying to proclaim one's a winner over the other. Dame does a great work.
Yeah,
but you're going to get 1,200 pages of prospect profiles, rankings, and breakdowns of my process in transparent ways that are hopefully entertaining. I try to make them as such, and everything's bookmarked in a PDF and very navigatable because I have bookmarks up the wazoo, so that you can go anywhere and choose your own adventure with it. But you're going to be able to see how I break them down against each other, how I look at these classes historically, what trends are happening with each position, and you get these detailed takes based on what I see on the field. Quarterback coaches have used it. Wide receiver coaches have. I've worked with Drew Lieberman, who's worked with guys like Andre Yosivas, Dontavian Wicks, Julian Edelman, Mohamed Sanu, guys like Olamide Zacchaeus. He's worked with a lot of guys like that, and I've learned a lot, applying my technique to guys like that, to that position. It's one of the most, Dane's and mine are the two most purchased draft guides by NFL scouts as an outside resource, according to guys like Alex Brown. So that's the pumping it up of it. You'll be pleasantly shocked at what you get. And then I give you a fantasy take, more fantasy oriented takes, short term with fit based on the post draft, where you get the 2-page long cheat sheet that gives you sweet spots of where you should draft them relative to me saying, I like this guy better than most folks, or I like this guy less than most people, so that you either let them fall to you and know when to take them if you get them. And you'll know, like, you'll look at a guy and go, well, Matt obviously doesn't want me to touch this guy. And then you'll see another one where he goes, okay, I'm getting a 2-round discount on this guy. And so I show that player fit, what the depth charts look like, an analysis of the depth charts. And I rediscuss why I think Ladd McConkey will be a top fit, as opposed to Marvin Harrison is a more questionable fit than where his value is. And you get all that for $21.95 at mattwaldman.com. And then I do newsletters each month, that update you on the 2026 class and thoughts like that. And I do projections and rankings for Dynasty as a separate product, where I give you all the answers. I do projections for every team and every imaginable player, and you get a cheat sheet that's got about somewhere around 350 players on it that I rank and update throughout the season, so that you can kind of see where my values are with them. But I don't give much commentary there. I'm like, if you just want the answers, there's the answers, but you're paying more because all the work that I do up front is for this cheaper product that I want people to see. So that's what you get.
Definitely check it out. I think I said it last year, but I'll say it again. If you've been interested in like the late round prospect guide and the modeling and the analytics side of things, this is a great compliment. It's a massive monstrosity of a document with the information inside of it. You will be very, very happy with the purchase. So definitely check it out. Go check out the late round prospect guide still.
Please go get that. If I may interrupt.
Yeah, of course.
And just say, because I'd rather blow the horn for you on this end and say, because like between you and Harmon, like guys like what we do independently with this type of stuff, we're giving you and it is very complimentary because you can see where we, like this whole show, where we differ and why, and you can see the process and how that works well. So with what you do so well with the modeling, and again with, you get historical factors that go into that, that give you a much more clear-minded idea of like, when should I take a risk?
Right.
Is this a risk that's worth it to me? Or should I just hold back and go, I really like these shiny, bright toys here, but maybe for the betterment of my team, maybe this is where I should head.
And look, sometimes it's fun to just get the shiny new toy. You're just playing Dynasty for entertainment purposes. But yeah, I said this year especially, I drove home in the prospect guide that the model is there to tell you when to deviate from draft capital. That's really what this comes down to. And then I'm watching these guys as well. It's just not the thing that I know that I'm providing the most value with. And so I can add that commentary, but I'd rather have smart folks like you come on and give even more detailed commentary on that side of the game. So thank you, Matt. Again, let's make this a yearly tradition. Do this each year. Everyone check it out. Check out Waldman's rookie scouting portfolio. Unbelievable work that he put into that. Otherwise, enjoy your weekend, and thank you for tuning in.